house on I'm going to call this a full house, on Wednesday afternoon. Welcome. Today it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome here Professor Ann Komaromi, who is going to speak to us about the conceptual artist Ilya Kabakov. Professor Komaromi is Associate Professor and Acting Director of the Center for Comparative Literature at the University of Toronto. One of her major areas of research is late Soviet unofficial culture, particularly Samizdat. She is the author of Uncensored, The Quest for Autonomy in Soviet Samizdat, which came out in 2015 from Northwestern University Press. And she's also been developing a related digital project with the University of Toronto Libraries called the Project for the Study of Dissidence and Samizdat. And it's a collection of electronic editions of Samizdat literary and art journals, as far as I understand. She's currently completing a monograph on dissident publics entitled Soviet Samizdat, Imagining a New Society. And her work on Kabakov, which she is presenting to us today under the title Ilya Kabakov and the Rubbish Heap of History, is part of her comparative study of the use of trash in works by various artists in the post-war era. So please join me in welcoming Ann Komaromi.
Thank you so much, Maya, for that generous introduction. I want to thank Joshua Tucker, Director of the Jordan Center, for the invitation to speak today, and Sasha Shpitanik for all the help making this visit a reality. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share with you a portion of my developing project, which takes a comparative look at the use of trash or discarded objects in artistic works and museum exhibits. The plan is to consider work by Robert Rauschenberg, Tadeusz Kantor, and Ilya Kabakov juxtaposed with consideration of exhibits in Holocaust museums to explore what the use of such objects might show about our relationship to the history of the 20th century. In general terms, my working thesis is that such works facilitate an often uncomfortable resurgence of the sense of the human body and the human scale against schemes and systems that seem to dwarf and, at the limit, erase human beings. The larger class of artifacts might seem to accomplish this refocalization of our perspective onto the human figure, but I find that trash or discarded objects convey more specific effects. They hover on the borderline or gap between existence and non-existence, between usefulness and superfluity, as well as between art and life, in a particularly acute way. By calling the human figure of the spectator into dialogue with the scene, rather than simply representing the human within the work, such artistic and curatorial use of discarded objects resists the urge to humanize or sentimentalize the scene, and thus creates more tension that has the potential to activate viewers. So far, I've focused my research on Kabakov, who, as a former Soviet conceptualist artist, is close to my previous research on unofficial Soviet culture. And in the case of Kabakov, trash as material and theme appears to be a particularly well-developed and specific means for engaging with Soviet life and history. Kabakov's installation, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment from 1985, a mixed media installation, is probably his best-known work. It was shown as part of the large retrospective exhibition of works by Ilya and Emilia Kabakov at the Tate Museum, and this was on display between 2017 and 2019 at the Tate Modern, then at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and finally at the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. Notice that in The Man Who Flew into Space, the floor is covered with debris left by the man's supposed launch through the ceiling of his room in the communal apartment. Debris, detritus, and trash are widespread elements across many types of works by Kabakov. I'll return to these installations in the last portion of the talk, but I want to start by exploring the material and conceptual basis for Kabakov's use of trash. And I think it's useful to consider both what Kabakov said about the objects he used in his artworks and how his use compares with a select set of other post-war movements and practices. And I'll start by juxtaposing Kabakov's idea of bad quality things, plahia vieshi, to the practice of artists in Italy associated with Arte Povera. While there does not seem to have been any direct influence one way or the other, I haven't found any evidence of that, Kabakov's art arrived in Italy before it was shown elsewhere in the West. There's this intriguing Italian connection, and that was around the time the artists who would be associated with Arte Povera were developing their distinctive practice. It was Italian Communist Party member Antonello Trombadori who visited the Soviet Union in the early 1960s and saw Kabakov's unofficial work. He took a number of examples of drawings from Kabakov's Shower series, which Kabakov began in 1962. This is a later member of that series, and included them along with other nonconformist Soviet artworks in a show in the central Italian city of L'Aquila in 1965. Italian audiences hailed these works as the first examples of Soviet avant-garde to be seen after Stalin. Art historian Matthew Jesse Jackson noted that Kabakov's work, in its own way, exemplifies something like the quest of artists associated with Arte Povera to realize what Polish theater director Jerzy Grotowski described as poor art. Grotowski advanced his notion of poor theater in an article of that name in 1965. Acknowledging that theater would always remain technologically inferior to film and television, Grotowski proposed to strip away all the luxurious trappings and illusions created by fancy lighting, elaborate sets, costuming, and music of modern theater, and to leave the actors to rely on their voices and bodies in a more unmediated and physically closer contact with the audience. Italian Arte Povera likewise eschewed linguistic transformation and the conventions of representation in their works, which, as in this untitled piece by Giovanni Anselmo, combined basic organic materials and mundane manufactured elements to illustrate the action of natural forces, such as gravity, electricity, wilting. They also evoked fundamental elements of human nature and experience, such as memory, emotion, vitality, and sensory experience, referring, like Grotowski did, to ritual and ancient or primordial forms. Kabakov cites Mertz's installations as a significant precedent in the tradition of installations in which he would also come to work. Mario Merz used the question "che fare," what is to be done, in works beginning in 1967. Lenin's 1902 pamphlet of the same name was reprinted in Italy in 1968, where it resonated with protesters. Merz set a neon rendering of the words "che fare" in a pot of beeswax, where the slight heat of the tubes acted to soften the wax and emit a faint smell. In this way, the artist reflected the energy coursing through Italian society, where many intellectuals of the time felt sympathetic to the revolutionary ideals of the Soviet Union. As the exhibition of Soviet nonconformist artists showed, however, some of those intellectuals were open to contemplating the contradictions and complexities of late socialism. Working in the late Soviet context, Kabakov developed his own techniques. From the late 60s, his works involved what he called these bad quality things, plahia vieshi, to explore the possibilities created by incorporating three-dimensional objects that projected out of the plane of the painting, engaging the tactile imagination of the viewer. The rendering of these objects was deliberately basic, and the combination of them was absurd. And the term absurd was much used at that time by unofficial artists and poets. They're absurd in that they have no relation to one another. The objects emerged out of their white background, and that white background is a knowing and belated echo of the infinite space of Milevich's or El Lisitsky's paintings, without quite taking on their own existence and without being justified by clear symbolism, narrative significance, utility, or beauty. Kabakov's equivocal relationship to the light or white coming from the paper or the canvas was more contradictory and complex than that of his avant-garde predecessors from the pre-revolutionary and early Soviet periods. And Malevich is particularly significant for Kabakov in this regard. Kabakov's attention to banal, everyday things distinguishes him also as a post-war artist. For Kabakov, the bad quality things in his art display the general condition of the material world around him, from the everyday objects like cups or toy balls to artworks, which themselves, as Kabakov understood them, invite interpretation and evaluation, but which also, as he sees it, open back towards the empty chaos from which they emerge and from which they never quite escape. Both Kabakov and the Arte Povera artists staged encounters between things and spectators that brought things physically closer to spectators and invited their reactions. That is, their works had theatrical qualities. Kabakov's works became increasingly theatrical over time as he moved from the drawings, paintings, and multimedia paintings towards installations. He developed a distinctive use of mixed verbal and visual elements that in some cases modeled spectator responses to the visual scene he presents. And I gave you translations of a few of these to show the way the responses are as isolated from one another as the objects. They're not really communicating with one another. By the 1970s, Kabakov had developed a series of albums which he began performing for audiences in his apartment in 1974 and 1975. These previewed the total installations he would mount in the 1980s and in the decades to follow. In many of his total installations, Kabakov's works would evoke construction and deconstruction. They exhibit this material poverty that goes along with the temporary, contingent, and or cobbled together visual texture of the scene on display. And in the Red Wagon, you can see the constructivist type of scaffolding on the front with the ladders going up to the sky. And in the back, you have the rubble and the debris from the construction and a kind of broken down ladder. One of the biggest distinctions between Kabakov's poor materials and those of Arte Povera is the fact that Kabakov did not use natural materials or objects. He has been interested exclusively in dry trash, musar, the detritus of human construction and the objects of everyday life. In his attention to the objects of contemporary Soviet life, his work resembles, to a certain extent, pop art, and that is how many foreign viewers initially described it, as Soviet pop art. The analogy is limited, however, and I think when we look at major examples of Soviet soc art, familiar works by Vitaly Komer and Alexander Milamid, Alexander Kosalapov, and others, we can see how they more obviously recall the aesthetics of American pop art. The use of visual cliches, the references grasped in just a moment of looking, the transfer of mass-produced visual culture into the space of personalized artistic production. These are techniques used in the American pop art of Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, and others, and they're found in Soviet soc art works that are often visually gratifying and instantly humorous. These are not really Kabakov's techniques. But the European understanding of pop art was more capacious. The term got used for a lot more, It also included Robert Rauschenberg, who was discussed as a pop artist by Soviet art critics. Rauschenberg might, as Lucy Lippert says, be more properly considered a father of American pop art, influential for, but kind of previous to that generation. And Rauschenberg's works provide, I think, some particularly intriguing points of convergence and divergence with those of Kabakov. Both Rauschenberg and Kabakov in their early years would scavenge the streets of their cities, New York and Moscow, picking up discarded items and or materials left lying around construction sites, garbage heaps, or on the curb. Rauschenberg's Charlene from 1954 exemplifies his tendency in what were called combines to put together a very heterogeneous set of found objects, including, in this case, a broken umbrella, a man's undershirt, a scarf, and other items. An early work by Kabakov, Cubes, from 1962, seems knocked together from scavenged wood pieces, covered with planes of uninspiring paint, suggesting what he also talked about, the difficulty of finding good materials in the Soviet city. This piece also highlights the distinctive way Kabakov was from early on in his unofficial artworks engaging with an unredeemed and unredeemable materiality over and against the utopian dreams of his avant-garde and constructivist forebears. We already saw the way Kabakov developed his techniques for juxtaposing heterogeneous elements, pipe, stick, ball, fly, in his object paintings of the 1970s. By the 1980s, some of his installations included a truly bewildering array of objects. These include The Rope of Life, 1984, The Man Who Never Threw Anything Away, 1985, and Box with Garbage, or Box with Trash, 1986. These objects, if you can see it, they appear to be labeled, but the labels do not explain the objects or their relationship with one another. And in the case of Box with Trash, the slips of paper affixed to objects feature angry curses. Take a hike and get lost scumbag are sort of milder examples than what's there. And while we can still here identify individual items, the items do not really have a readable relation to one another the way they do in a Rauschenberg combine. In a Rauschenberg combine, going back to Charlene, there may be formal relations among, for example, the various circular elements, the sequence of vertically positioned rectangular units. One can also look at the different instances of found fabrics, scarf, undershirt, lace, umbrella, certainly when images are used. The relationships of images and their formal properties can also be set into some kind of meaningful relationship with other elements in the composition. The Rauschenberg paintings Factum 1 and 2 feature the repetition of images. There's the repetition of images internal to each of the paintings that feature a slight time delay. There are two photographs, two different moments of the burning building in the newspaper clippings at the bottom of the composition. And there seems to be a slight difference in angle, so slight you almost wonder whether it's actually there, between Eisenhower in one version and in the one right next to him. So you have this kind of confusing repetition and difference within the paintings, and then you have the two set next to one another, almost exactly the same, but not quite. So this, raises issues of repetition, difference, and the passage of time, and that's a reflection that's intensified by duplicating nearly the same work in Factum 2. Another famous Rauschenberg, Canyon, shows us there are themes of flight, motion, and beauty evoked by different objects he uses. And these themes go across works, media. He uses family photographs and allusions to classical myths. So these invite interpretation, even if it's hard to fix any one given interpretation as correct or sufficient. Rosalind Krauss talked about an aspect of Rauschenberg's art that she found to be entirely original. As opposed to elements in Cubist collage or the collages of Kurt Schwitters, for example, Rauschenberg's objects retain their materiality from outside the composition more strongly. That materiality is never entirely absorbed into these formal relationships and or the interpretation that you might give them. The various objects refuse to be entirely incorporated into the picture plane. They don't yield everything to the abstract composition of formal elements, nor to a thematic interpretation. They remain insistently themselves, yet they also encourage an active reading that takes time. In thus producing an experience of durée that extends through the reading of assembled objects, Rauschenberg's compositions are, she said, like the space of memory. They thus implicate time more than the self-contained images of Warhol's pop or of most Sots art. And I dwell on that a little bit because I'm going to bring that back to talk about using a same model of durée and reading for Kabakov, but at a different level. Kabakov's heterogeneous trash items function differently. Kabakov also suggests that the trash items could be tokens of memory, as in the installation The Rope of Life. However, the description of the installation is tellingly imprecise. Quote, all kinds of small pieces of garbage are attached to the middle section of the rope by thin strings. A broken toothbrush, empty bottles, buttons, papers, etc. It's hard to even tell what the objects might actually be. As in other installations with trash, each item has a small label. Yet the labels do not explain the items, and they do not cohere into a life story. So one, for example, reads, Autumn 1935, running through the gray gates along the cobblestone pavement until the next block. And that's followed by Summer 1935. That couldn't be followed by. Actually, it may be. The rooster tried to peck on my eye, but instead got my cheek. And 1940, the cover on the table. So they don't tell you what the objects are, and they don't make a life story you can actually appreciate, even though these things are affixed to a rope that is supposed to represent one person's life. Incorporated into the large installation 10 characters, the rope was linked to a character called Parfyonov, who had moved out but left the rope. The children play with it, the cat plays with it, and then the other residents notice the rope with its objects and labels and try to decipher it. Most of the speculation, however, concerns the two empty ends with no objects. What do they signify? The children find a note left by Parfyonov in which he discusses the project. Quote, I decided to describe my life in the form of a rope and to arrange on it all of the events of my life in the order in which I remember them, not distinguishing the important from the unimportant, since for me they were all equally important and significant. Isn't that so? End quote. This character Parfyonov, who is absent, like most of Kabakov's characters, suggests via the note that the two empty ends signify something mysterious beyond human memory, something that precedes human memory and consciousness and something that goes on after it. Notice also that in this schematic view, the affixed labels make it look like a spinal cord in the middle. However, the items themselves are too small and too banal to signify much on their own. They're barely specified, and they struggle to impress themselves upon our perception in any meaningful way. And this is true in the documentation of it, all of the photographs I've seen, and in the written description of how to put together this installation. The labels, though supposedly related to the life of the character, are isolated, incoherent. The objects, like these events, sort of surface for the viewer to contemplate and slip back almost at the same time into a meaningless void. Trash for Rauschenberg represents a more developed example of trash for Kabakov represents a more developed example of the picture objects, pipe, stick, ball, fly, that emerged out of the void but never completely assumed significance. This trash is the stuff of human life and everyday social interactions. In the installation 16 ropes, the ropes are hung at eye level, 168 centimeters apart, so that they form a horizontal surface, filling the whole room. Spectators can wander among the ropes and examine the pieces of trash suspended vertically from the rope at regular intervals of 12 to 15 centimeters. Quote, a cork, the top of a can, an empty matchbox, etc. The spectators are thus as if submerged in a sea of trash, which is a phrase that Kabakov uses elsewhere. They will likely examine the labels, bob up and down in between the ropes, and these labels will contain, in this case, fragments of everyday speech. Vitinka, come over this evening, I'll make crepes. Which short ones? 3 rubles? And let's not wait for the bus. Let's walk a bit. Again, this is the stuff of everyday Soviet life, but it's not conversation that links these statements to one another. And in his dialogue about trash with Boris Groys from 1990, Kabakov says that trash, musor, in part connotes Soviet reality. Quote, this whole reality represents one big garbage heap. But it also, in part, connotes, quote, our culture, which is characterized by its unfinished quality, the imperfection of form, not thought through, not cleaned up. The ordering, the separation and labeling is the product, as he says, of our Russian imperial consciousness. Kabakov goes on to say, quote, to think that every separate thing is just trash and rubbish, drang, but that all this rubbish should be accounted for and labeled. He links this to this Russian imperial consciousness. Everything, including a person, he says, is given a number, like in a warehouse. Chaos is given order. Unending chaos and trash, and at the same time, unbroken order coincide. Right? So he's talking about it in various different ways, relating it to Soviet life, culture, and consciousness. But the other connotation of trash is personal, and this is very much there too. It may be incorporated, as the rope of life suggests, into an archive of memories, another phrase that he uses. Kabakov said, the attempts to remember one's own life, the memories of one's own history, never lead to the clarification of the main thing, the chief goal of existence. All that is left are some scattered flares of consciousness associated with all sorts of insignificant things. Kabakov and Groys addressed the flickering, mertsania, of trash objects that surface to consciousness and threaten to recede at the same time back into the void. Kabakov described a scene, quote, it happens that a person stands near a trash basket and holds something and thinks, vacillating, throw it away or keep it. This precise second of delay, this moment of vacillation is what interests me. In this moment, the chances of throwing it away or leaving it are about the same, end quote. This vacillation, flickering between leaving it and throwing it away is what he aims to capture as an artist. Quote, at that moment of vacillation relative to the thing, I, like a demigod, decide its fate. And I decide my fate. I can decide that my memory will continue to live in the drawer of my table, and I can destroy it, carrying it out to the trash basket. Such flickering mertsania is a principle of Soviet conceptualist art, described by Dmitry Prigov relative to the way the writer-artist identifies with the voice of a created character while also clearly being distinct from it. And Kabakov also used the term to describe this ambivalent relationship to his characters, like Parfyonov, in the installations. And many of those characters are, as he sees it, like artists, trying to capture and represent life, and failing in absurd ways. Kabakov, the artist, acknowledges his implication in such quixotic utopian artistic projects, while also standing apart from it, representing it and critically reflecting upon it. The problem of trash for Kabakov is thus human and existential. It's also social, in that it relates to the marginalization of some people by the system. In the case of the Soviet nonconforming artist, a certain identification with trash may reflect the artist's own desire to remain unnoticed by the authorities, to pursue her activity undisturbed in the corner. At the same time, she fears being ultimately swept away, forgotten, consigned to the rubbish heap. Kabakov's overwhelming desire as an artist to join world culture, to become recognized in the international art scene, was one shared by many of the nonconformist artists. Kabakov embraced that anxiety and thematized it in trash to great effect. Boris Groys wrote in a 1985 article about the theme of trash in Kabakov's art, and he considered the relation of this theme to Platonic ideals of justice, beauty, and goodness. In Plato's dialogue Parmenides, Socrates denies that hair, dirt, rubbish have any ideal form. Their only existence lies in the contingent material reality that meets the eye. Thus, there is something philosophically insurgent about the dirt and trash that challenge an ideal metaphysics. While Marxist-Leninism espoused historical materialism, its will to power might be spied in this latent idealism, its hostility for the rubbish of reality that resists a grand narrative and explanatory scheme. Groys emphasized the endless heterogeneity that resists any attempts to impose order or ideals on it. And I think this is the conceptual essence of Kabakov's trash. In a famous formulation, Trotsky denounced Yuli Martov and the Mensheviks at the Second Congress of Soviets in Petrograd on October 25, 1917. "You are isolated and pathetic," he said. "You are bankrupt. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, to the wastebasket of history. Storную корзину истории." There's so many ways of saying wastebasket and ash heap and rubbish heap and dump, and this was the term he used. Another widely known example from the other end of the political spectrum can be found in President Reagan's speech to the British House of Commons on June 8, 1982. Reagan proclaimed that, quote, "Freedom and democracy will leave Marxism and Leninism on the ash heap of history," a formulation his speechwriters surely chose for its resonance with Trotsky's aggressive attack. Kabakov and other nonconformist Soviet artists may have known also the quote from Lenin that appeared in a 1974 book by official Soviet art critic Irina Kulikova. In her denunciatory analysis of the philosophy and art of modernism, Kulikova quoted Lenin writing about the genius of Marx and Engels, who, as Lenin said, quote, "showed how to pursue the same materialism in the sphere of social sciences, mercilessly sweeping aside like garbage, sor, nonsense, vzdor, the inflated, pretentious gobbledygook, galimatier, the countless attempts to discover a new line in philosophy to acquire a new direction and so forth." Right? These new philosophies and things, that was all the gobbledygook and nonsense. Kulikova cited Lenin to support her method, which she described as, quote, a rigorous application of the Marxist methodology in the analysis of the philosophical bases of modernist art that will make it possible to uncover its intellectual direction and social essence. You may not be surprised to hear that the philosophical basis of modernist art turns out to be, for her, not good. This is definitely nonsense used to illustrate modernist art. And it is curious to see how the language of hostility to non-Marxist philosophy, in this case used by Lenin, echoes the Platonic anxieties about the endless heterogeneous gobbledygook of Western philosophy and, in this case, modernist art. One of Kabakov's other famous installations, The Man Who Never Threw Anything Away, also known as the Garbage Man, another figure we never actually see, whose project is in evidence in the fantastic room he inhabits in the communal apartment. One day, men arrive to read the water meter, which is supposed to be in the man's room. It's not, as it turns out. But since the man is out, Uncle Misha, who is the senior tenant, breaks down the door to let them in. And when he does so, the tenants and the workmen stand amazed. The entire room is filled with neatly sorted trash. Flat things, containers and jars, piles of paper and manuscripts, and small items strung up in bundles are all arranged according to their form. There are papers and folders, including a series of trash novels, Mussornie Romani, in many volumes, which seem to be something like memory books of the man's life and experiences. While notes in the book and labels on the items record the moments of collection, in this case too, they yield no coherent narrative or profile of the man. Uncle Misha bends over to read one of the man's manuscripts, which contains ruminations that echo some of Kabakov's own. In the piece labeled Dump, Svalka, the man writes, quote, the whole world, everything which surrounds me here, appears to me a boundless dump with no ends or borders, an inexhaustible, diverse sea of garbage, end quote. The essay swerves into pathos, if not bathos, as the man ponders the endless array of trash items produced by the city, which, quote, cry out about a past life. They preserve it. Is the dump a feature of socialist life, he wonders? A visit to relatives in Czechoslovakia produced the impression of such cleanliness. Why? Why is it so clean there? And what about this land, which belongs to no one, behind our house and has become a dump? Doesn't it loom threateningly beyond our walls, like an enemy surrounding a fortress, returning over and over again to our building, submerging it? End quote. What if, he thinks, it's even worse than that? Quote, our entire place, all of our enormous territory, is a dumping ground for the garbage from all of the rest of the world. This is, I would suggest, among other things, the anxious rumination of the global provincial, the person who knows he inhabits a country outside the global center and who fears that the mental and physical process of sweeping out the trash on a global scale will simply bury him in the dump of the unseen and the insignificant. In another way, the man's quixotic project to collect and sort all the detritus of life around him is more than personal. Like Nikolai Gogol's Akaki Akakievich, the man voluntarily, enthusiastically copies the Soviet imperial project to colonize life and reality, producing what is here obviously absurd, meaningless archives. If we return to Krauss's idea about the resistant materiality of objects in Rauschenberg's works, we might observe that in Kabakov's case, it turns out not to be a matter of spending time reading the relation of different trash objects, since they resist relation and ultimately repel reading. Rather, the task involves spending time reading in part, the relations between the visual elements of the scene and the verbal elements of the scene, the texts or commentary that accompany them. And this produces the durée of the experience of the installation. Although I think that there's a problem there too, in that the different pieces don't necessarily add up to the kind of story or meaning or recovery of the absent person that we expect them to. So Kabakov no longer has to fear being left out of art history. His works and writing on the genre of the total installation have been firmly incorporated into art history. Influential art historian Claire Bishop, writing about installation art in recent decades, opened chapter 1 of her book on the subject with Kabakov's The Man Who Flew into Space. She described it as being exemplary of one type of installation art experience, which is like dreaming, she said. According to Bishop, works like Kabakov's demand that we, quote, imaginatively project ourselves into an immersive scene that requires creative free association in order to articulate its meaning. In this way, she wrote, we may read the elements of the installation symbolically as metonymic parts of a narrative. I would point out, however, Kabakov's distinction between the objects and the space. Kabakov noted that Western art is oriented to the object, while for the Soviet mentality, he said, objects hardly matter. It is the space, whether of a communal apartment, school, bureaucratic office, or other environment that dictates how people think and how they relate to the situation. I've argued that trash objects in Kabakov's art resist absorption and interpretation, while the discrete trash items impinge with difficulty on our perception. And I think that can be generalized to some extent to other elements of the Soviet cultural objects he assembles. Kabakov's comments about the obviously constructed nature of the installation space, which he says should turn attention to the ideal nature of the project or event they enclose, implies a different type of reflection and association. The space partially dictates how the viewer will interact with it, but it also, because it's artificial and constructed, leaves viewers free to pursue that reflection in whatever mode or direction they wish, and to leave the space. They're not, in fact, obliged in the totalitarian way he kind of evokes. I have some doubts about the possibility of interpreting a narrative and of becoming entirely absorbed in the fantastic stories of eccentric characters like these, who lack the humanity that would make us identify with them or their world in that way. Bishop quotes Kabakov, who wrote that, quote, the main motor of the total installation, what it lives by, is the cranking up of the wheel of associations, cultural or everyday analogies, personal memories. Bishop glosses this by saying, in other words, the installation prompts conscious and unconscious associations in the beholder, end quote. These unconscious associations for Bishop are related to the surrealist predecessors that she sees as being significant for this type of dream-like scene into which she inscribes Kabakov's recent interventions. But the problem here, as I see it, is that the associations, cultural or everyday analogies, and personal memories are not for Kabakov part of a Freudian subconscious, where powerful impulses capable of exploding or transforming the world are buried. The impulses driving the attempted utopian transformations are staged right in front of us. They're right on the surface. And they seem less opposed to the reigning order than weirdly reflective of it. Moreover, inasmuch as the installation of a Soviet communal apartment might recall personal memories for a former Soviet person who was familiar with that material, environment, and atmosphere, it evokes different associations for Westerners who have perhaps an ethnographic interest in this other life from behind the Iron Curtain, and also politicized ideas about what that life is. Bishop's account assimilates the strangeness of Kabakov's depiction of reality to a Western theoretical perspective presumed to be universal. Without a doubt, there is something universal about the associations evoked in spectators by the Kabakov's installations. Everyone dreams of making the world a better place. The utopian impulse is universal and an essential part of being human. When it does not grotesquely seek to dominate every relation to reality, which is the other part of that Kabakov talks about. But the Soviet specificity of the installations about which I'm speaking here introduces also a difference in viewers' perspectives, depending on what they know or what they think they know about Soviet and Russian life. Another way to imagine the principle of duration and difference working in the case of Kabakov's installations might be through reading the restaging and anthologization of repetitions of these installations at different historical moments and in different material circumstances. Kabakov returns to themes and scenes. Malevich and Musor trash are really big among them, working them out in different media and varying configurations, scenes, and texts. Kabakov has restaged installations with different objects over a relatively long historical trajectory. Notice how much more visible these objects are and graspable, especially from a kind of pop art sort of sensibility. So he's been restaging these from the late Soviet period to perestroika to post-Soviet times, early and later, as well as in different contexts in Russia and in the West. The installation means different things for different audiences. And so I would suggest that they might support a syntax of reception, reading them that way. The retrospective exhibition that traveled from the Tate to Russian museums recently evoked a new echo of the ethnographic interest that was always there for Western viewers, to see the communal apartment, these strange characters, this hard and deprived life so full of fantastic ideas and imagination. For Russian viewers, the exhibition evoked complex feelings. A reviewer writing in Kommersant about the show in St. Petersburg reflected on the changing reactions of Russian audiences over time. In the early post-Soviet years, around 1992, she said, the ironic conceptualist analyses of late Soviet style, everyday life, symbols, sign systems taken to absurd extremes seemed to have little to do with Russian audiences then. People were ready to shake off that old Soviet life, that old communal life, in search of a bright individual future. However, by the time of the 2018-2019 show in Russia, Kabakov's works evoked, she said, quote, chaotic and fearsome feelings. The albums in particular struck a nerve. Quote, the mothballs of Kabakov's closet are impossibly active still. We're all ready to hide in that closet. And the only place to fly out of it, it would seem, is into the cosmos, end quote. The album may now tap into the realization that post-socialism brought a new series of dreams and aspirations, while the reality continued in new ways to be as hard as it had been at the time of sitting in the closet, Primakov. Western reviews resorted to some old cliches about the horror of the totalitarian state. The header on a review of the Tate show for The Guardian said, quote, with its harrowing echoes of repression, deprivation, and murder. Kabakov's art is a magnificent, moving monument to the millions crushed by communism. End quote. You can Google it. This seems out of touch with the more complex and subtle effects of Kabakov's installations overall. And yet, in the installation, Not Everyone Will Be Taken into the Future, the use of red light and of darkness, this kind of creeping darkness that is, as Kabakov describes it, characteristic of a late stage of his approach to art. I'm not entirely sure how it fits into his own personal artistic trajectory. It means something more than just the darkness of communism, however. but you can see how it might arouse that sense of danger. And the danger associated with Russia has surely not been entirely relegated to the past in the Western imagination. Matthew Jesse Jackson, an informed and thoughtful viewer, identified the main theme of the retrospective as failed utopias. And yet, he quoted the Kabakovs on the fact that, as they saw it, quote, the elimination of utopianism, alas, is also yet another form of utopianism. The Kabakov's art, above all, says Jackson, quote, allows us to see more clearly all of the things that we have lost over the course of those years, as well as all of the things that we never could have had. And he concludes, learning to discern the difference between the two may be the ultimate instruction to be discovered within the art of Ilya and Emilia Kabakov. So a syntax of reception would mean that the reality of these works is activated most of all by their interaction with different audiences in different historical moments and contexts. There's an irreducible materiality to these encounters that Kabakov invites us to consider as part of the meta-series he and Emilia continue to stage. That meta-series of works and installations repeated over time in different contexts evokes the passage from the Soviet era to post-Soviet times, as well as the passage from Russia to the West. But it does not yield to any grand narrative about what happened or what the Soviet experience might mean. It suggests most of all that the lived Soviet experience was real, and that its reality resists our attempts to wrangle and organize it with narratives about a lost utopia or a triumphant liberal order. It shows us that the memory is part of our shared collective imagination, even if we may not agree on its historical significance. Thank you.
So I think now we can open the floor to discussion. Do you want me to moderate, or are you fine with?
Whatever you think. I think I can mostly see people.
Go for it.
If I drift off, feel free to jump in.
Please.
Yeah.
I have a question about trash in Soviet and other cultures, because you mentioned this kind of aspect, but it seems like in the Soviet Union, trash functioned in a different way, right? Piling up periodism were the tactics of survival, because sometimes it can be used again. So I wonder how Kabakov works with fetishization and artist attitude towards objects, in terms of their, like, just to clarify that in capitalism it's most likely surplus objects, right? And what is it in socialism then?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we think of as maybe him scavenging for materials is also related to the practice of finding metal and materials and things that had been a sort of Soviet social project that kids participate in and things like that. So I think Kabakov is not necessarily engaging all of the aspects of what scavenged materials or quote-unquote trash might mean in Soviet culture. And I think the fetishization of the object, as you said, is something he specifically resists, although, in as much as that moment of vacillation, he's projecting that, any given trash object, if I throw it away, I may be throwing away part of my memory, I may be throwing away myself, and this kind of attachment and then the sort of obsessive need to collect everything, right? Be a hoarder and label it all and organize it. Then you could somehow, capture your life and control reality in a way that is obviously impossible. So I don't know whether I'm. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering if you could maybe comment more about on Kabakov's relationship to theater. From this lecture, it seemed that trash in some ways emerges almost as a natural object for theater, as an object that is opposed to kind of capitalist circulation that inherently resisted, and therefore releases everything that is non-object oriented, meaning human relations, right? Mm-hmm. So looking at the Rauschenberg's objects and his treatment of trash, the kind of opposite trajectories were very evident. While Rauschenberg recuperates them into capitalist objects for the art market, what we see in Kabakov is actually the focus on the humanistic, on everything that kind of creates that objects and that is kind of exists between. So I was wondering if he was working on theater or the regime of theater.
Thank you for that question, which I think I have too many things I'm thinking about in relation to it. But you know, the conceptualists, the Moscow conceptualists, generally a kind of collective actions. We're doing these events, and something like Soviet happenings and staged events is very much part of what the way that kind of Soviet conceptualism develops. So I'm sure that had some resonance for him. He talked about the fact that official Soviet art was so didactic. It's really about delivering a message. It's about educating people. It's the correct position being related to you through the painting or through the novel. And he wanted to create a greater dialogue. And we can think in terms of Rauschenberg and some of these other incorporations of objects that are not fine or nice, this deliberate opening out to the world and trying to bring things from the world into the artwork. And in the American context, that was also related to what was coming after abstract expressionism. So if abstract expressionism is very much the flat painted surface that is fetishized in a way, then you have people like Rauschenberg working in a more three-dimensional capacity, and this really is about trying to work in this gap between art and life, as he said, and engage viewers. So I think for the specific Soviet context, and I don't know, I can't answer the question whether Kabakov was working with other people doing theater in ways.
More in terms of theories of theatricality.
Yeah.
Because it seems that in theater all objects become trash because they're not part of, the objects are not part of art market, they're not part of commerce, so they're kind of
resisting commodification.
Exactly, it's a status of an object in theater which becomes about human relations.
Yep.
I
think that's right. And I think that Kabakov maybe takes it a step beyond where Rauschenberg could go, because if you have these objects that sort of remain these heterogeneous materials in the combine assemblages, then Kabakov is already reducing those objects. I mean, it's really not worth trying to keep, the trash objects he uses in the installations. But what it's about is that human-to-human relation, and it's also opening out to the contingency of the context and of the audiences who bring whatever it is that they bring to that encounter with these Soviet scenes that he staged or other scenes that he staged. Thank you. Yeah, Lisa.
Yeah, I was just curious to think about the sort of movement of these objects from installation to museum collections.
Mm-hmm.
And this question of, and partially this is my own information about how static the organization of material is when it moves between sort of iterations of the installation.
Yeah.
But then also on a kind of, and this may be beyond what you sort of dealt with, but in the back of the scenes, like with the collection management, is each individual object relabeled then for a collection and for documenting the transportation of these items between the Tate Modern and the Hermitage.
Yeah.
And so what that's like behind the scenes in museums.
No, I think that's a fantastic question that I would love to be able to
Obviously
answer.
I'm biased, but
No, but I think that's exactly where this would go. If you're genuinely interested in the materiality of the repeated scenes of staging, then you have to wonder how curators are handling that, what kinds of directions the Kabakovs are giving them about, can you just pick up some trash in Moscow to replace the objects on the ropes? Does it have to be the same ropes? I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a great question.
Related to that, I'm taking him as anti-art, but specific. Joseph Beuys, complete opposite. He sacralizes everything. fur, felt, plastic, deserves, worthy of museum because it is art.
Yeah.
That's the Picasso mentality. Everything you do is art. That's one side.
Yeah.
And then anti-Fluxus. Fluxus is international. I worked with Nam June-Pak for 30 years, and we did a voice thing together. He's not an international. He's Russian. I won't call it provincial because Russia's big. But Fluxus is, Lithuanian, which might have even been part of Russia at that time. But he's not moving in that direction. Doesn't seem to be that interested in it. In other words, he's not just that kind of content-heavy reading of every single thing.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of mentality, but it's interesting, and it is certainly a statement of a unique artist.
I think so. I think it's just, and as you say, he connects the distinctiveness of the way he's doing this with being Russian and Soviet. This distinction between being object-oriented or being space-oriented, and the construction of a space that exerts certain expectations on viewers.
A couple of things between the questions or comments. One is about, I think there are some, from what I know, there are some installations that are very personal for him and for Emilia.
Yeah.
And I know that some objects are literally something that is very dear to them that they put into the installation. And in that case, there is this very personal value.
Yeah.
Or the mother.
The mother.
Story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I know the school library, one school library that's at the Stedelijk Museum, it's Emilia's own very cherished stuff that she actually gives away, but really cares about. And then there are these anonymous characters like Kabakov and non-fictional characters.
Yeah.
And then I also wonder to what extent you're considering the entry of Emilia into the story. And her being the stage designer, her being the lighting designer, her being the designer of that experience as a kind of marketing
Yes.
partner.
Yeah. Yeah. That is also something I would like to understand better, and that I think I have to understand better to pursue, to any degree, this kind of reading of a syntax of reception, because that's such now, a distinctive addition to the way he's working now in a pair with her. So, I have sort of superficial impressions from what I've read, but I'd actually like to hear more from them if I can, and from others who have analyzed her role in it. I know she did say in one interview, when asked about, how his mother, who had this genuinely extremely difficult life and did so much to support his education and trajectory towards becoming the artist that he became, what that meant for him as an artist. And she said that there was a distinction that was hugely important for him in terms of his character and personally, but that it didn't impact his art. And yet he's made this labyrinth of the work about his mother that I think then does really invite us to consider what has to be a different relation to the objects displayed and the material, where it certainly is a much more human story. So that's a counterpoint to the things I'm talking about here, I believe.
I think there is a moment when she actually enters into the story and she's quite open about it, where she begins to shape things a bit more. And just if you don't mind, one last thing, one other element, which I wonder how much you're thinking about, is the scale.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a huge
difference in scale.
Difference in scale.
Yeah.
Also, when they start working with models for the installations, they did this whole exhibition, Hirschhorn, or elsewhere also recently with models of the large things or the small things where the scale is leveled.
Yeah, and I mean, so that's fascinating too, as a way of rethinking how you perceive what these are, and I mean, and their continued career, and the degree to which there's so much actually, but this tremendous success and this tremendous productivity over all of these decades is it's quite something to sort of And that was why trash kind of was one way in to an aspect that certainly does not encompass everything about this really rich artistic practice. But I think you're raising great questions that bear addressing.
You've written about the materiality of Samizdat in the past, and I'm wondering if you think the Samizdat text can be seen as a poor object, and if this influences how we either or if this new project has given you any insights into it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's kind of why I was attracted to the theme of trash, both because it's something that, you know, he wrote and talked so much about, and because I had been working with these Samizdat texts that had this poor materiality, and that poor materiality was significant. I think it's significant in a different way. I mean, I'm interested in the way poor materiality becomes an index of marginalization of people and activities. Also the way it can be fetishized, certainly in Samizdat. And again, I think he's aware of that and resisting it to some extent in his own practice, while yet continuing to emphasize the very specific kind of Soviet material aspect of the scenes and things and characters he's staging.
Yeah, for me, I'm interested in how, you know, there's some similarities between his albums and Prigov's books or Nekrasov's books, or the way that way they use language and the sort of dialogues they make. But you know, his handmade books are very beautiful, whereas those other ones are poor, and so yeah, I'm not really sure. I'm trying to figure out what to make of that myself. So I was wondering if you had.
I'd have to probably work this out a little bit, but I think there are different types of poor materiality. I don't think he's interested in engaging with sort of poor Samizdat materiality. I think what he's doing is something, you know, that's a little bit more specific in his practice.
And Rubinstein's category cards is somewhere in between there. I mean, there is a materiality, but also statement.
Yeah, and I think also because if you think of verbal trash, the way that he shows it in a lot of the labels, I think Rubinstein and Prigov are also working with a lot of cliched language, and language that maybe is dead but yet has some sparks in it, and they're sort of. But I think Nekrasov, for example, is trying to bring out that spark by kind of putting, you know, taking pieces of language and bumping them against one another in his poems. I don't think that's quite what Kabakov is doing, but I think all of them in different ways, including Rubinstein and Prigov, are working with that banal language pieces. And that they're doing it not the way writers do it, when we think of sort of rich original language use as being, you know, what we value traditionally in poets and in prose writers. They're doing something that, you know, I think Prigov would talk about it as sculptural. Sorokin also, you know, they're taking pieces and putting them into compositions to do different things, which is fascinating, I think.
Tony Nemedy from the New School, thanks so much for really elegant and thought-provoking talk. I have a question that I think picks up a little bit of what people have been asking about. It has to do with text and narrative. I found the connection with Rauschenberg really interesting and thought-provoking. I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about the differences between the texts, the use of text and titles in both of them. I mean, Rauschenberg seems to kind of close down the possibility of sort of having a discussion about it, or the painting opening up into some sort of narrative, whereas Kabakov's all do the absolute opposite.
All about.
Yeah, they're all about creating some kind of narrative. And I just wonder, you know, if you've thought about this and how one, you know, how you make sense of it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I guess Rauschenberg kind of famously would say you can't interpret these works as, you know, like biographically or in terms of a narrative, and yet people would find clues to, in fact, you know, make, not to fully absorb them into some kind of narrative, but it was possible to do that and interesting to do that. And kind of paradoxically, Kabakov is more openly working with narrative, creating narrative, and using narratives, and yet, what do I want to say about it? Like he's subverting the interest of the narrative. The narrative isn't really the point, I think. Even the man who flew into space, right? They try to figure out where did he go. They never find his body. What happened to him? I don't. Like it sort of doesn't matter, which is interesting. But I think he's using narrative, and I think he's picking up narrative because it was so devalued by people who wanted to be doing interesting contemporary art. They saw socialist realism as being too literary in the paintings, right? Because it was the illustration of a scene, it was the whatever, too literary. And literaturnost in visual art was pośle, sort of at best it was vulgar or banal or just ideologically suspect, which is precisely why Kabakov picks it up, because it's a kind of trashy means of making art, I think, and I think he uses it that way, meaning that it's not actually that interesting to try to interpret the narratives.
But isn't it true also that, I totally agree with that, but it seems to me that they're also begging for some higher significance in the work. Utopia in this one, the idea of transcendence, and so it seems to me there's something, there's some interesting kind of.
Well, there is, and in the albums, right? So, the guy is sitting in the kind of Malevich black square closet, and then, he opens it up and he looks at the world that he doesn't really want to be a part of, and he flies out over it, and he flies into the white expanse above Bandarsky Cry. It's absolutely sort of transcendence and utopia are engaged in most of these works, but they're also compromised. So it's the little verbal sign down in the corner that ruins the perfect black square or the perfect white square. There's something that isn't supposed to be there in a good evocation of a transcendent sphere or utopia. Yeah.
Thank you again. That talk is fantastic. I'm just interested in this syntax of reception. In the official Soviet criticism, at least at certain points through the 20th century, the idea of reception was something that was dynamic or rather than passivized, right? That it was a constituent part of how things were created, that there was an anticipation of reception, or even factoring in to the creation of the object of the reception of the audience. And I'm wondering if the dissident artists who don't have access to the public in the same way that other Soviet official artists would, that the building of like a negative space or partial objects or incompleteness into a work is a way to overcome or compensate for the lack of the interaction with the receptive public in that way.
Yeah, I think that may very well be the case, and I think that particularly before they start getting much access to audiences, and then of course many of them didn't quite get as much of an audience as they hoped for. That's just driving so much of what they do. And Kabakov embraces that and thematizes it in a way that others don't. And I don't know if this is what you're thinking, or maybe you can tell me, but that kind of trashiness or debris I see as one manifestation of this anxiety that he's just sort of, and his work is going to sort of be trashed. Thank you so much.